So this morning what I'd like to do is look at the 15th century. This is the 1400s. My hope is to kind of help us regroup a little bit. It's been, a while. We've had the summer, we've had our fall studies of vocation and so on. So it's been a while for all of us. So hopefully we can kind of regroup and rethink where we were and look at the high points of the 15th century. And there's one particular person that I'd like to highlight in our conversation who I have to say is someone I've been intrigued with for a long, long time. One of the most intriguing, mysterious, somewhat perplexing but impressive people in the history of the story of God's people down through history. And some of you may have studied this person more closely than I, and so if you have additional supplemental information you can provide as we wrap up, I'd appreciate it. But it's the young woman who played such a prominent role toward the end of what's called the 100 Years' War, and her name is Joan of Arc. And so I want to give a little bit of attention, at least kind of let her have a cameo appearance for us this morning as we think about the events that are going on. But as I think of Joan of Arc, I think about someone who probably seemed, even to herself, let alone to everyone else who were her contemporaries, a highly improbable warrior. She was born a peasant girl in a tiny rural community that everyone would have thought in France at that time was just the outback. And as the question was raised by Nathanael, can any good thing come out of Galilee or out of Nazareth? I think people might have said something like that with respect to Joan of Arc and her early beginnings. She, by her own testimony, claims to have been visited when she was 12 years old by saints of the church. We'll look at this a little bit later, but she was told at that point that it was going to be her duty to bring about a military reversal in the 100 Years' War that had been raging now for some 70 years already. And I can imagine her response might have been something like a character in the Bible who may have been feeling somewhat like that, and I'm thinking of Gideon. So I'm going to read this text from the Old Testament concerning Gideon and a conversation he had with the Lord, which in many ways had a similar kind of ring to it. So I'm in Judges chapter 6, and this is in verse 11. Now the angel of the Lord, this is the Word of God, by the way, still is the Word of God, 6 months later, still here. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, as his son Gideon was beating out the wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon gives some initial protests. I'm dropping down to verse 14. Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. I hereby commission you." And Gideon answered, "But sir, how can I deliver Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." And of course, the rest of the story as it unfolds, that this unlikely warrior became one of the most important and courageous in the history of Israel. And certainly, young Joan of Arc would have seen even more unlikely a warrior and more unlikely a person to have really in many ways inspired one of these remarkable reversals in history. So we want to think about her a little bit this morning, but we'll do a broader assessment as well of the time. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll get underway. Our Father, we're grateful for your mercies to us. We thank you that you have once again brought us together. We thank you for the warmth of Christian fellowship with brothers and sisters in Christ. We thank you for the great story that has been unfolding through the hundreds of years since the advent of Christ and will continue to unfold until his return. We thank you that we can play some role in it. We thank you that even though most of us feel quite ordinary, that it has been your pleasure to do extraordinary things through ordinary people. And we thank you for even this young woman, Joan of Arc, who was used so powerfully in her day. And we thank you that you proved yourself strong in her case, and that we can learn lessons for ourselves as well by reflecting on her life. All of this we give you thanks for and ask your blessing on our conversation now in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we are thinking about the late Middle Ages. This is history. I'm just going to lay it on the table, but you know, you cannot tell the story of church history without telling European history and vice versa. The two are intertwined so deeply, so profoundly, that one doesn't make sense without the other. So just indulge me this morning, the luxury of doing a little bit of just the history of what's going on, because it will indeed help us to understand how the Reformation got traction, and we'll be getting to the Reformation within the next week or so. So that's coming to a future near you, but right now I just want to give this kind of assessment of where we are. There's probably three areas that would be the primary focus of interest in the 15th century in Europe. One of them would be what's happening in Spain. So I want to look at that a little bit this morning. The second would be this ongoing conflict between England and France, which is usually called the 100 Years' War. And the third one would be what's happening in Italy and the Holy Roman Empire, and this is called the Renaissance. I want to look at the first two of these this morning, and then next week we'll shift our focus to the Renaissance, because in many ways the Reformation got its roots in the Renaissance, both positively and negatively. And so we need to understand that, and it's an important enough topic that I don't want to try to crowd it in to an overly hectic conversation this morning. So we're going to start by thinking briefly, just for a couple of minutes, about Spain. The main focus I would like to shift to is the 100 Years' War. But you'll recall from last year we talked about Muhammad, born 570, died in 632. 2 years after he, with military forces from Medina, had conquered Mecca and established this great world religion known as Islam. From 632 on, there was an explosive expansion of the Islamic religion, mostly at the point of a sword. And so the Islamic forces, first of all, took over the Arabian Peninsula, which happened very rapidly. From there, they reached up into what we would call Palestine, the Holy Land, and also made it clear up into the southern part of Turkey, over into Mesopotamia, down into Egypt and across North Africa, and up the Strait of Gibraltar into the Iberian Peninsula that we call Spain. And so by 711, a little less than, about 70 years after the death of Muhammad, you have this amazing, explosive growth of the Islamic religion. And now they are in Spain, which puts them really in Europe. And they take over Spain and keep pushing their way north. And you may recall that the final point where they are sort of stopped in this advance is at the Battle of Tours in 732, 100 years to the year after the death of Muhammad. Charles Martel stops them and pushes them back into Spain, and that's where they are. So that's 732. Now this map shows you 790. Remember, Charlemagne was crowned the emperor in 800. But one of the contests that he had already been fighting by that time was a contest over at least part of Spain. And so this little yellow part at the top of this map is showing where there was basically a Christian presence in what was otherwise an Islamic region. So the green at the bottom is Islam, the yellow at the top is the Christian presence, and Charlemagne himself fought several battles there. Any of you who are familiar with that classic kind of poem, the Song of Roland, you ever heard of that? Anybody read that? Song of Roland. It really takes its roots from this particular era and the conflict that was going on between Christians on the one hand and the Islamic population called the Moors on the other. And so it's quite an interesting time in history, and that's about where things are in the year 790. By the year 900, we have more or less the establishment of a kind of peaceful coexistence between the Christians in the north and Islamic population in the south. And the Christians had divided up this northern section into several sub-provinces. So we have Galicia there on the west, we have Asturia. Then we have significantly Castile and also Aragon. Those two have become at least part of this family of Spanish provinces now, and they are coexisting with the Islamic folks by paying tribute, which was, of course, part of the Islamic regime, that you could live as a person of the book, as they put it, by paying tribute, and so that was exactly what was going on. And so this is about the lay of the land by the time we get to 900. However, 250 years later, there's been a gradual growth of the Christian presence and a gradual crowding out of the Islamic folks, you see. So they're being pushed kind of to the south. The payment of tribute has stopped. Now at this point, it's almost a kind of equivalence of power between the two, but you'll notice that the Christian population is continuing to increasingly push its presence further and further south. So that's what it looks like by 1150. By the year 1300, the Islamic population has been crowded down into a little region right at the south of Spain called Granada. So these have now just kind of hung on to a toehold, and as it turns out, they are paying tribute to the Christians. So this is where we are by 1300. So there's been over this several hundred years now a gradual growth of the Christian presence and a gradual diminishing of the Moors who were populating that region. That's about where things remain for 150 years. Mid-15th century, we have two people who would be extremely significant in the ensuing history of Europe born. One of them is named Isabella. She's born 1541. She became the Queen of Castile. The other one was Ferdinand, who was born the following year. He became the King of Aragon. And so we have these two major Christian provinces now in Spain. And of course, these two, as you know, I should have gotten the pictures up here. Nice looking. So there's Castile, there's Aragon, and as you know, they got married when they were teenagers. So in 1469, we have the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. And they become the rulers of the entire Christian portion of Spain at that point. By uniting their two provinces, they are able to win the submission of the royalty in the other provinces, and so they become the rulers then at that point of Spain. They continued to collect tribute from the Moors in Granada until 1480, when there was a revolt. And the Islamic folks there, for whatever reasons, it remains unclear, but for some reason they revolted and refused to pay tribute anymore. So what precipitated that is not altogether certain. It may have actually been forced a little bit by Isabel and Ferdinand. But in any event, that was all that was necessary to declare war. And so Ferdinand and Isabella declared war and marshaled the military power that they had at their disposal to go after Granada and to go after the Islamic forces there. And the battle lasted for about 12 years, ending in 1492. Now, you may know Christopher Columbus had been banging on their door for some time. From Genoa, he had this crazy idea that you could find the East by sailing west. And so for the last 3 or 4 years, he'd been looking for a sponsor. And he thought this was probably the most likely prospect. So he'd come, and they kept saying, hey, we can't do it. We're busy fighting the Moors down, and come back when we're done with this, and then we'll talk to you. So 1492, with the end of this battle, Christopher is Johnny on the spot right there on their front porch saying, okay, here I am. And so they finally relent. And Isabella especially is interested in commissioning Columbus, not simply for the trade prospects of forming a contact with the East, but she is a deeply devoted Roman Catholic faithful, and she's thinking more of the missionary prospects. She wants Christopher Columbus to find a way to open the door for the proclamation of the gospel as she understood it, a faithful Catholic queen at this point, to reach the people of the East for that purpose as well. If you read, some of you I know have read, the journals of Columbus, which are readily available and worth reading, you find peppered all through his writings allusions to that particular part of his quest. He is not simply interested, at least by his own expression of it, in trade connections or even his own glory, he constantly makes reference to the great vision of the gospel of Christ being spread to the east, and that he wants to be at least part of the mechanism by which that would take place. If you take Christopher Columbus at face value, you would have to say that he had a deeply devoted concern to the cause of Christ, as well as to whatever other things that were of concern to him in terms of the trade connections and so on. I say that because, of course, Columbus, as you know, has been subjected to a brutal amount of revisionist historical treatment in recent years. But for my money, I think he was a good guy, and I think we should probably honor his memory, even though in his own time he was probably not appreciated as much as he should have been. But anyway, he did get this support for now from Ferdinand and Isabella, and off he goes, and the rest, of course, as they say, is history. The family of Isabella and Ferdinand is interesting to us, and so I'd like to just run through this really quickly, and then we'll move on. They had 5 children. The first of these was Isabella Jr., and she married Alfonso, a prince of Portugal. You may have noticed in the map I showed you earlier, Portugal was a separate region off to the west there, as it continues to be to this day. Their second child was named Joanna. She married Philip, who was a prince of the Habsburg family, which ruled in Austria. And if you know the name Habsburg, you know it became the dominant family, ruling family in Europe for hundreds of years. And so this is a very important liaison that's formed now at this point between the Spanish on the one hand and the Habsburg on the other. It'll be further cemented later. Most importantly, these two, Joanna and Philip, had a child whose name was Charles V. Charles V became the Holy Roman Emperor for 50 years, roughly. I mean, I'm overstating that, but in round numbers. From 1519 to 1556, he's the Holy Roman Emperor all through the beginning of the Reformation. He's the main political opponent to the beginnings of the Reformation. You know, the Reformation began with Luther in the Holy Roman Empire. We call it Germany, but then that was, was part of that empire. He was also the ruler of the Spanish Empire. And so he becomes arguably the most powerful political character in the world. And we have to reckon with him as we tell our story. So I just want you to have some idea where he came from. He's the grandchild of Isabella and Ferdinand, and those are his dates. The next child they had was John. He married Margaret of Austria, another Habsburg, further cementing that relationship. They had Maria, who married Manuel I, the king of Portugal, and then finally their youngest child was named Catherine. Now, Catherine was an very devout Roman Catholic in her own right, and she married a prince by the name of Arthur, who was, of course, English. He was the son of Henry VII. Henry VII had come out on top following what's called the Wars of Roses. The Wars of Roses was a kind of aftermath of the 100 Years' War. And so there was quite a scramble in England as to who was going to come out on top. The Lancasters, as you recall, and the Yorks had this ongoing conflict, but finally Henry, who was a Lancaster, is able to maneuver his way into the prevailing position. But England is hurting at this point. They've gone through a bloody battle with France, and then this internal battle just makes it worse, and England is scrambling for some kind of position of security, and one of the most promising prospects that Henry VII could think of was to form an alliance with the most powerful country in the world, namely Spain. And this youngest daughter, Catherine, therefore, was a good prospect to marry this son, Arthur. And so at 15 years old, the two of them married. Unfortunately, Arthur died about 6 months later at 15 years old. And by almost universal consent and testimony, there was no consummation of the marriage. They were too young. They were technically married, but not married in the practical sense of living together as husband and wife. And so Catherine, though she had been married, nevertheless is still, in a sense, in her, she's a virgin. You know, that becomes part of the story that plays out sometime later. Well, the death of Arthur puts Henry in an awful position. He thought he was set up. You know, he had this wonderful connection to Spain, and all of the resources of Spain now would be become an alliance with him. And the death of Arthur, of course, makes it very touchy for him. So he decides he'd like the widow of his son Arthur to marry, of course, the younger son of Henry, Henry VIII. And Henry VIII and Catherine do marry, and that launches a whole interesting story I'm going to save for later, but at least you understand that's kind of where the whole deal gets going. We call it the English Reformation. I use the word Reformation very guardedly when I talk about Henry VIII, because I'm not sure it qualifies as Reformation in the sense I like to use that word, but this is kind of what got that whole thing going. So that's Spain. All right, and now we move on to the second of our topics this morning, which is going to be England and France. And so let's take a look at what's happening here. This is France in 1337. There is a little region, you'll notice, down in the southwest called Gascogne or Gascony. It is owned by and controlled by the English. It's the only toehold that the English have in France at the time. But the English claimed the right to rule all of France, and they had for many years. In fact, this was an ongoing source of tension between France and England, because on multiple occasions the English king, including Henry VIII actually, claimed to be the king of France as well. The reason for that claim goes back to the Norman conquest of England in 1066 under William the Conqueror. And of course, this Norman king was French. He was a descendant of the Vikings, but he was a legitimate French ruler. And when he took over England, he nevertheless maintained a claim to rule at least a large portion of France. And that claim continued to be nursed by the subsequent Norman rulers of England for years to come. And so all through the Magna Carta period, all of these kind of events that take place, that still is kind of in the back of people's minds in England, that there's some kind of claim that should be realized to the control of France. Well, it never really was realized, but it continued to be this source of tension between the two. And when we get to 1337, we find that England is actually controlling a little tiny part of France, which is this region down here at the southwest. Last year, we spent some time talking about what's called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. So you hopefully recall something of that. This was a conflict that arose between the Pope in Rome and the King of France. And as it turns out, under the circumstances of the time, the King of France won. He actually kidnapped the Pope at the time, put him in prison. He died. The subsequent Pope became kind of a puppet under the control of the French king. And in order to keep him there under his control, he moved him to a region called Avignon. And so this is the Avignon papacy, as it's called. And the Pope now, rather than being in Rome, is living just in the shadow of the French rule in this little region just outside the bounds of France proper, but certainly under its control. So the Pope now is, of course, almost required to be a cheerleader for all things French. And that would in particular mean to be hostile to all things English, because England is making claims contrary to France. And this did begin to breed in the English psyche a certain kind of suspicion for the Pope. And it was during this century, of course, and this rising kind of concern and suspicion and skepticism about the Pope that you begin to see the beginnings of the English parting company with the Pope, at least psychologically. And that's why people like John Wycliffe could get a hearing, because he was quite outspoken in his criticism of the Pope. But the only reason he was getting a hearing at all was because that was part of what was happening in the broader English psychology as a result of this tension, you see, that we have described here. The other reason the English were interested in France was because of a region called Flanders. Up to the north of France, you know the poem Flanders Fields. This is the region. It was very prosperous for its woolen trade. So the English had multiple designs on France, and that's kind of what's happening now in the early, late 14th century, going into the 15th century. All right. By 1360, England had invested a great deal of effort in controlling a large portion of France. And so the map looks like this by the time we get to 1360, and they are continuing to push their claim to control France. This is the beginning of the 100 Years' War now that we're talking about. The Pope, of course, was fully supporting the French cause. This was fully alienating the English with respect to his partisanship in this whole conflict. And so that's kind of the lay of the land here. When we get to 1378, this Babylonian captivity ends, but things go from bad to worse because, and again we talked about this last spring, the Babylonian captivity devolves into what's called the Great Papal Schism, in which now you have the French Pope still in Avignon, and you have another Pope competing in Rome and so the two popes are now excommunicating each other, calling each other the Antichrist, and other choice descriptive terms. And so again, you have to say, if you're a Roman Catholic person living at that time in history and you look at this spectacle, it makes you wonder. It doesn't make you wonder so much about the depth of your own faith or confidence in the fundamental truth of the Christian religion as you may understand it, but it does make you wonder about the integrity of the leadership, you see, when you begin to see that kind of thing going on. And so this is happening, and that great papal schism lasts for some 40 years or so. It actually became worse because you may recall from last year, there came a time when there were 3 people claiming to be the Pope, and so it just became kind of a ridiculous sort of embarrassment, you might say. And the English were getting traction off of that, especially John Wycliffe. So John Wycliffe's career, we talked about him last year, is all against the backdrop of this, as is the career of John Huss. Wycliffe and Huss are both operating against the backdrop of this just completely embarrassing circumstance in the highest levels of the leadership of the Catholic Church. In many ways, that's the reason they got the hearing they did, was because everybody saw the evidence of the corruption that they were claiming. Well, be that as it may, the French did launch a successful campaign against the English, and by 1405, now the beginning of the 15th century, England has been more or less pushed back to the fringes. They have a little presence up there in Calais, they have a presence in Normandy, and they're still down in Gascony. But basically, it looks like the French are going to be able to get rid of them, except that in 1407, Charles VI, who is the King of France, goes bonkers. For real. We don't know if it was some kind of schizophrenia or psychosis or some such thing, but clearly he had a complete mental collapse. But of course, at the time, he's still the king, and because of that, those who viewed the king as the king would still do what he said. And there were gratuitous assassinations, there were killings, there was bloodshed and mayhem, and all kinds of awful things were happening because this king was just out of control. And it was creating a huge amount of concern and upheaval and a hostility in France in general, until finally the Prince of Burgundy revolted and started a civil war. So in 1407, the King of Burgundy launches a civil war against the King of France, and this became the great opportunity for England to reinsert itself into French affairs. And so the English, seeing the vulnerability of a civil war in France, saw in that their opportunity to come back to town, and that's exactly what they do. They make this invasion. They have a major victory at Agincourt, which is to the north there, in 1415, and it's right at this moment that Joan of Arc is born. She's born, actually, I don't have it on this map, but if you see those 2 circles there, she's actually born in a tiny little village called Domremy, which is right between those 2. So she's born in a tumultuous situation where you've got the English coming in from the north, the civil war going on involving Burgundy to the south. So she's surrounded by a great deal of this kind of upheaval, and her birth takes place just about the time the English are coming back to town to once again challenge their control of France. Let's see how I'm doing on my time. There we are. All right, well, Probably fortunately for France, Charles VI died in 1417. His first four sons had also died under very unusual circumstances. So the person that came to the throne was a young, inexperienced teenager who came to be called Charles VII, and he claims the French throne in 1417 on the death of his father. The problem with that, as you may know if you know this history, is that under French law, the King of France could only be properly crowned in a little city called Reims. And Reims, let me get this right there. So that little town right between these two warring factions is where the prince would need to be crowned. What takes place, I kind of skipped by these, so I'll go back and take a look at this. So what happens was that Burgundy and England join forces. They become an alliance, and they launch their campaign now together as allies against France. This takes place about 1419. Joan of Arc, when she was 12 years old, and by the way, she maintained the truth of this story in the face of threatened torture and indeed being burned at the stake. She never recanted this story. She held it to the end. And so all I can do is take that at face value. I'm as much a product of my culture as you are, you know. But this is what she said, and so I'm just going to report it to you, and you can use your own judgment here. But she said she was visited by three saints in the Catholic pantheon of saints here. One was Saint Michael, one was Saint Catherine, one was Saint Margaret. She's 12 years old, and they told her to drive out the English and to bring Charles VII, this youthful king now, to Reims, where he would be crowned King of France. Now, I don't know what you do with that when you're 12 years old, to be honest with you. You know, that would be quite an experience. But it certainly was life-transforming for her. If that's all we knew about Joan of Arc, we wouldn't be talking about her 500 years later, you know. Because the fact of the matter is, at that time in history, there were a lot of peasant girls who were claiming to have had visions and seen various saints of the church and so on. This was quite a common claim. And so at least at this point, Joan is not saying anything that, at least in terms of the zeitgeist of the time, would have been all that uncommon. It's what she did with it that, you know, kind of makes her stand out as something of an unusual case here. But anyway, that's her claim. She makes that for when she's 12 years old. All right, history unfolds. By 1429, this English and Burgundian alliance were poised to take all of France. So if you look at a map, the gray part to the north is controlled by the English and the Burgundians. The smaller region to the south is what's left of France. And if you notice, all of it is hanging on a little city there called Orleans. And that's kind of the point that is holding up the continuation of this advance. Orleans has been under siege for 2 years. The common wisdom is, if Orleans falls, France falls to English rule. So there's grave concern about the welfare of Orleans. And that 2-year siege, which ended in 1429, had begun about 1427, and that's when the 17-year-old Joan of Arc, who had had not only the initial vision but a couple of others, went and demanded an audience with the king, and was kind of laughed out of the secretary's outer office. You know, come on, girl, go home. You know, do something that peasant girls do. But she came back with such relentless determination that eventually they were so impressed with her, an illiterate peasant girl, and yet so convinced, and had such kind of native genius about her, that they finally said, okay, we will let you see the king. And so in she comes before the king. And she tells the king the story, that she has been commissioned to lead an army against the English at Orleans and to lead them to a great victory, and free France from this invasion from the English. And the king, who's about the same age as she is, just shakes his head. He can't believe it. But she is so insistent that finally a very tiny little army is given to her. I don't know how tiny, but it was not very many people. But okay, well, let's see what you can do, And so, with that much horsepower, she leads this little army, and there is a series of dramatic, striking, rather shocking victories, and each time she wins a little battle, more join her, so that by the time we get to the actual battle at Orleans, she has a pretty good-sized military force with her. She always went into battle, she fought, she put on all the armaments that you would wear, and she went in. She was not anything but a person that was up front and personal on the battleground. She was wounded multiple times. One time she took an arrow right through the neck. Now, it had to be some kind of grazing wound because she was back in the battle within about a half an hour. But the people who saw that were so inspired by her that alone caused them to kind of rally to the contest. But it's more than that. I think anyone that studied her life realizes she was a military genius. This was not just a fluke. She changed the whole battle strategy of the French army, which had been quite conservative. She laid out battle plans. She had some kind of native genius about battle tactics that were kind of a wonder of the day, considering she'd never had any training at all. She wasn't Napoleon, who had gone to a military school and studied all this stuff, It just sort of came intuitively to her. But she won victory after victory until finally, in the major showdown at Orleans itself, she was able to defeat the English and save Orleans. And this was, of course, one of the most remarkable and decisive and shocking reversals in the history of European warfare. And so it is for real. I mean, whatever we make of her, you have to say that was quite a remarkable feat. Well, she went into battle with this battle standard. This is a replication of it, but it showed Jesus in a posture of judgment, and the name Jesus and the name Mary shows up. So that was the battle standard. That was the flag that was flying as she would go in. She leads the army into the successful liberation of Orleans, but of course that doesn't achieve her objective. She has to get the army up to Rheims, which is where the king needs to be crowned. And so in another series of striking victories, she leads the army through this hostile territory and beats a path, kind of a wedge, as you can see on the map there, up to Rheims, where in fact Charles VII is crowned, and for the first time, Joan actually bowed the knee and called him her king, because until then he hadn't actually been crowned. So that was all in 1429. Okay, so the first part of the 15th century. Then she was captured by the Burgundians. There was kind of this lull, and in a moment of whatever exposure or something, there was a skirmish, and she was actually captured by about 8 guys who just grabbed her and dragged her off the horse and put her in prison. These are Burgundians now. Everybody assumed that Charles VII, the king, would do whatever was necessary to have her liberated. That would have been common, a prisoner of war exchange or some payment of a ransom or something like that. And he probably could have won her freedom, and that's what people thought would happen. But he was kind of spineless, actually, and so he just let her twist in the wind. To this day, historians are a little bit perplexed about what exactly drove him, but he's not viewed as a particularly honorable ruler. But for whatever reasons, he just kind of leaves her there, and so he's generally blamed for what took place in the ensuing history, for failing to intervene. The Burgundians, having her as a prisoner, sold her for a handsome amount to the English, where she was tried for heresy in a politically motivated trial. It's very interesting. The court transcript of this trial is available. It's been published, and you can probably Google it up and read it this afternoon if you'd like. What you discover as you read this is the testimony of a woman who is at the same time illiterate. She's not educated. She could barely sign her name, and yet brilliant. And she is playing chess with some of the most brilliant theologians in the world at that time and can parry every move of theirs. It's really quite a wonder. The most famous incident in this trial, this is the cardinal questioning her, and the question that was put to her was, this is one of many, this is just kind of a typical inquisitorial question. It's a baited trap. There's no good answer to it. You can't get out of this one. It's kind of like the should we pay taxes to Caesar question that was put to Jesus. You can't, have you quit beating your wife type question. There's no way out of the question that saves you from guilt. The question that was put to her was more subtle than any of those, though. Do you know you are in God's grace? Was the question. This is one of several like this. The trap was this. If she said no, then she would be basically admitting that she was doing all that she was doing on her own steam and that God was not in it, and therefore she's a heretic. If she said yes, it would contradict church teaching at the time, because the church taught at the time that nobody can know for sure whether they are in God's grace. That continues to be a Catholic teaching to this day. It's a Protestant understanding to have assurance of salvation, not a Catholic idea. And so she can't win, you see. How are you going to answer this question? Her answer is, quote, if I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me. The notary who was taking this down, transcribing all of this testimony, and it, as I say, is available to this day, testified that at the moment the court heard that reply, quote, those who were interrogating her were stupefied. They couldn't get past this gal. You see, she just was always that bright and that quick. And so she's a remarkable woman. At 19 years old, remarkable, memorable, well worthy of the memory we have of her as this remarkable person. You may know that George Bernard Shaw actually wrote a play on the life of Joan of Arc entitled St. Joan, and he famously took the transcript of the trial without embellishment, which was pretty tough for George Bernard Shaw. But he didn't even modify the testimony for the most part of this trial record. He just reported it as it happened because it was so good. Well, Joan was tried for heresy and condemned by this English court. The crime of which she was accused and convicted was wearing men's clothes, which was a violation of canon law. There was a perfectly well-known exception to the rule that would have applied to Joan under her circumstances, but that was conveniently ignored. And so Joan of Arc was burned at 19 years of age on May 30th, 1431. This statue stands at the place of her execution. They were so concerned about people turning her remains into relics that they burned her body 3 times, and then took whatever was left of that and threw it into the Seine River, you see, because she already was very famous for her accomplishments. Her battle tactics were basically adopted by the French army. It was a major reversal of what they had used as battle strategies, and over the next 22 years, using these Joan of Arc tactics, they drove the English out and eventually defeated the English in the 100 Years' War. The condemnation of Joan of Arc was itself reversed 25 years later by the Catholic Church, and the guy that had been her persecutor too, but her prosecutor at the trial was himself condemned as a heretic, but unfortunately he was already dead, so they couldn't do anything with him. He was already gone. But anyway, that was the finding of the church, and she, of course, was canonized by the Catholic Church in May 1920, about 500 years after her original condemnation. One of the biographers of Joan of Arc wrote, of course, extensively about her life, but this is kind of a concluding remark he makes. Quote, "The people who came after her in the 5 centuries since her death tried to make everything of her: demonic fanatic, spiritual mystic, naive and tragically ill-used tool of the powerful, creator and icon of modern popular nationalism, adored heroine, saint. She insisted even when threatened with torture and faced with death by fire, that she was guided by voices from God, voices or no voices. Her achievements leave anyone who knows her story shaking their head in amazed wonder. And I think that's probably a fair tribute. The reason I wanted to highlight her is because, she was an unlikely hero of the 100 Years' War, heroine of the 100 Years' War. She was about as ordinary as anybody by external measures could be. And one of the things I really appreciate about the biblical narrative and about the testimony of history is that God is delighted to use very, very, very ordinary people to do extraordinary things. When Jesus decided to go find 12 people to go out and change the world, he didn't go to the universities, he didn't go to the major academic establishments or the politically powerful. He went to fishermen at the Sea of Galilee, who were about as ordinary as anyone you could imagine, and chose them. And we still relish the memory of St. John, St. Matthew, St. Peter, Paul. All of these ordinary people that God used in such powerful ways. I don't know about you, I feel pretty ordinary, And left to my own devices, I'm just going to tell you, just keep this between us. I am basically worthless. But God is pleased to use basically worthless people to do worthy things. So if you ever feel a little worthless, if you ever feel like you just don't quite have what it takes to go out and actually do something that matters much, you remember Joan of Arc, okay? And you remember many other ordinary folks in history that God has been pleased to fill with His Spirit, because it is not by might nor by power, but what? By my Spirit, says the Lord.